Hey everyone, I'm Lisa Jordan, and welcome to Menopausitive.
I got a good feeling.
Where we take a refreshingly positive approach to navigating menopause. If you're looking for practical tips, expert advice, and honest conversations, think of this as your personal pick and mix for how to optimize your body. Although we can't prevent menopause, we can redefine it. And that journey starts now. I remember growing up in the 80s in Canada. Summer of '69 by Bryan Adams was one of the coolest songs ever in 1984. Celine Dion was only 19, but man, was she on a mission to become a global icon. My brother and I were first-generation Canadians. Our parents had escaped war in Europe and, like many, wanted to build a better life for themselves. Growing up, I was told you could have anything you want if you worked hard enough. I was also told girls can do anything boys can do. Today, I have a teenage daughter, and I find myself repeating the same lines. Isn't that funny that I have to reinforce the same message 50 years later? Don't get me wrong, it's amazing the progress that women have made, but it still isn't enough, really, is it? But now that the number of men and women in the world is roughly equal, it only makes sense that things start to come more into balance. We're seeing more women on boards, more women celebrated for their contributions to science, politics, more women at the center of great writing and great films. I was watching an interview with Nicole Kidman the other night. In 2017, she pledged to work with a female director at least once every 18 months to increase the number of women filmmakers in Hollywood. And since that time, she's worked with 15 female directors. Amazing, right? Well, it's also amazing that you're here with me today because together we're going to meet another woman looking to correct an imbalance, not just in science, but in our bodies. For the first time, we're uncovering secrets from inside the female body and learning how simple changes to our diet can make a big difference to hormonal balance. Sarah Berry is a professor at King's College London and chief scientist at Zoe. We've all seen it, that science and nutrition company, that bright yellow, the glucose monitor. She has dedicated 25 years of academic research to nutrition science, including 35 human nutrition studies, hundreds of research papers, thousands of lectures, to understand the relationship between what we eat and our health. She currently leads the world's largest ever research study on the impact of diet on menopause, while also being a mom of two, and I read an avid tennis fan. Sarah, welcome to Menopausitive.
Lisa, thank you so much for having me on, and I hope I live up to the expectations of that wonderful introduction.
Well, I was really worried that we were going to have you miss your weekly tennis lesson, so I hope you're not missing it this week.
I'm not.
Listen, before we dive deep into the research, I would love to just hear a little bit about how you found your way into science and nutrition.
Yeah, so Lisa, there's often this kind of idealistic view of how everyone has this burning passion for what ends up their final career. And I'll be honest, it was all to do with a man for me. So I had actually applied to study medicine. I didn't get the grades. I got offered the opportunity to study physiology instead. But around that time, I also met my now husband. And I still went off to university, which was in the north of England. My husband lived in London. So I spent the 3 years choosing all of my modules to fall on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so that I could race down to London on a Thursday night and didn't have to go back up to the north until a Tuesday morning. And all of those modules happened to be ones to do with like cardiometabolic health, to do with gut health, to do with nutrition. And so by the end of the 3 years, I realized, well, I still quite like the man that I'd been running down to London for, but more importantly, I really loved the nutrition side and learning how important food was in terms of impacting all sorts of areas of our health. So I then went on to do a master's in nutrition at King's College London, a PhD, a postdoc, and then I got an academic post about 20 years ago, and here I am 20 years later.
Amazing. So you've spent most of your career in academia. How has life changed since you joined Zoe?
So it's been a whirlwind. Working at Zoe is kind of like doing research on fast forward or on steroids. It's fast paced, it's agile, and it's really exciting. It's really exciting because for the first time ever, I'm able to actually put into action the science that I'm doing.
You and the Zoe team have just led this mother of menopause research and, looking at the impact of a healthy diet on menopause symptoms. I have a million questions, but I just want to take a really hot second to talk about why has this been an area that's been understudied?
So women's health generally has been understudied. Women generally are underrepresented in research. So there's this huge kind of what we call a gender data and research gap between men and women. And I often think of this in three key ways. So one is because historically, fortunately not now, but historically, men's bodies were considered the typical, the norm. Women's bodies were considered atypical. So scientists, clinicians were like, oh, well, we'll look at this in a normal body. Fortunately, that's changed. The second reason is for safety. So there has been situations in the past, like, for example, there was the situation with thalidomide, which many people might be aware of, that women were given as this anti-morning sickness drug during pregnancy and unfortunately caused very serious birth defects in their babies. And so around that time, it was considered unsafe to conduct research in women because of that incident and other similar incidents that had happened at a lesser scale. So actually in the US, for example, women were actually banned if they were of childbearing age of even taking part in research. Now that was reversed in 1993. And now in many countries, they actually say women should take part in research, and many grant bodies are encouraging this. But that's only 20 years ago that changed.
1993. That is insane. Oh my gosh. Am I right to assume as well that any research that was done was in postmenopausal women? So we have lots of research more on postmenopause versus perimenopause. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when it comes to the menopause, absolutely. Most of the research around the menopause is in postmenopausal women. There's very little in perimenopausal women. And then because of these safety concerns, there was very little in women of childbearing age. But then there's also a third reason, Lisa, and this is something that I've seen during my career. And it's a very practical reason of cost. It's actually really expensive to study women. And so when I'm planning studies and I'm writing that grant application that I told you about that has like a 1 in 10 chance of being accepted, I have to write a grant application that's very financially competitive because it's very, very difficult to get research funding. There's very little money out there. Now, if I want to look at the impact of a particular diet or a nutrient or, some sort of food on health, which is the area that I study, if I do that in men, I can actually cut my costs significantly because if I want to look at it also in women, I have to recruit a lot more people when I study this because I have to take into account their phase of their menstrual cycle. I have to take into account whether they're pre, peri or post. And so out of the 35 trials that I've run, nearly all of them, about 30 of them have been just in men. It's only recently that I've had funding to also look at women. And most importantly, what's really important is that actually the really big study that we're doing at Zoe and all of the research at Zoe is including women. And, and that's in my lifetime that it's been competitive. Now, fortunately, the tide is turning and research bodies are now saying, actually, we really do want to invest in women's health. So I do think it's changing. And so I think we have to think positively that for the future, this is going to change. So, yes, it's sad that's what's happened in the past, but it is changing. And what we need to do, though, specifically to do with menopause, is picking up on the point that you said earlier, is we also need to look at perimenopausal women. Because typically, if you look at all of the studies that are out there, the majority of the studies that are out there that have looked at the effect of a particular diet or lifestyle intervention related to menopause, it's always on postmenopausal women. And yet we know it's that perimenopausal transition period that can be from 2 to 10 years for women that's actually often the most burdensome, the most challenging part of the menopause
Absolutely.
transition.
And I think I agree with you. Listen, all we want to do is change how we move forward. And this is where we start, right? So this is why it's amazing that I think you guys are setting the scene for what's to come. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the findings, because although we can't prevent menopause from happening, I do believe we can prepare for it a little bit better. So in the research, you were discovering kind of biologically, physiologically, and if I'm using the wrong words, you can tell me, but what was going on in our bodies during this transition, like from pre to peri to post menopause?
Yeah, so there's two broad areas we've been looking at with our Zoe research. We've been looking at menopause symptoms in peri and postmenopause. We've been looking at how prevalent they are. We've been looking at how burdensome they are. And we've been looking at how diet and lifestyle interventions may reduce these symptoms. But we've also been looking at disease risk. And this is really important to consider as well, because it's great that many of us are talking about menopause symptoms now. We didn't talk about them years ago. My mother certainly never told me anything about her symptoms. And yet I know that she was hot and flustered a lot of the time because of
You would just find them in the fridge every once in a while.
But it's great we're talking about symptoms. But I think what we're not talking enough about, though, Lisa, is actually the increased disease risk that we see when people enter the menopause transition. And this is another area that we've been looking at. So looking at how as soon as women hit the menopause transition, their disease risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity, for example, increases. And so prior to the menopause, women tend to be doing really well compared to men. So at any given age, women tend to have lower blood pressure, lower inflammation, better insulin sensitivity, lower cholesterol, for example. As soon as they hit the menopause transition period, so become perimenopausal and postmenopausal, suddenly all of these, what we call intermediary risk factors, suddenly go up. So suddenly their blood pressure goes up and actually becomes even higher than a age-matched male. Their blood pressure goes up, their insulin sensitivity gets worse, their visceral adiposity, so the fat around their belly that we know is particularly harmful for our health, goes up, etc. And so it's really important when we think about menopause, we think about, yes, what can we do to help with symptoms? Because it's a bit of a vicious cycle. If you're not sleeping, then you less desire to eat well, less desire to be physically active. But we also need to consider this is an important point in time to take stock as well of our disease risk. And again, this is where diet and lifestyle can also really help.
And when you talk about when they hit this transition, I know it's a different age for everybody, but how would you know you're hitting the transition? Because what I find with my friends is, especially if you're still menstruating, if you're still having your period, you don't even think about menopause. So how do you know that you're starting the transition?
I think becoming menopausal is a lot simpler because we know that menopause is basically 1 year post your last menstrual cycle. So if you're menstruating, i.e. you don't have some sort of coil, for example, which, a large proportion of people now have. So lots of people don't even know that they've become postmenopausal because they weren't menstruating before. But for many people, it's quite clear when they're postmenopausal. So it's 1 year post that last menstrual cycle. The perimenopausal phase is that whole transition phase before, because you don't go to bed one night premenopausal and wake up, hey, I'm postmenopausal, that's it, all done. There's a period of time that can be from 2 to 10 years where your estrogen's starting to decline. Now, it doesn't decline in a nice gradual way that your body over the period of time just becomes accustomed to it. It's a time of real, what I call hormonal chaos. It's this hormonal chaos of the estrogen going up and down, day to day, hour to hour, which is why you can have this awful hot flush and then it can be gone like that. Or you can have a day where your brain fog is just like excruciating. And then the next day you have clarity. And because it's so variable, that's what I think makes it really challenging. And you hear lots of women say, well, I think I'm perimenopausal, but I'm not quite sure. I did have a hot flush about 2 months ago, but I've not had anything since. And it makes it challenging because how do you know if you're perimenopausal? And I think this is why it's really important to educate people. So, for example, we see in our own data, and this is data on 70,000 peri and postmenopausal women, that hot flushes or hot flashes and night sweats, which I think many people still think are the hallmark of the menopause or the perimenopause, they're actually the least common symptom. Only about 30% of people experience those. And many people actually might have one and never experience it again. And yet it's the other symptoms like poor sleep, anxiety, brain fog, memory loss, irritability, low libido, all of these kind of symptoms that more than 80% of women get. But the problem is I think many women are like, oh, well, is it just because I'm getting a bit older? So of course I'm getting a bit forgetful. And yet something that's very physical, like a hot flush, is like a really great indicator. But the problem is not many people actually get them. And so it makes it hard. We've developed at Zoe something called the Menoscale. And this is an online calculator. It's free for everyone to access. You can just go to zoe.com/Menoscale. And this is a calculator that allows women to monitor their symptoms. So this is a great way maybe to see if you're not sure whether you are perimenopausal. You could once a week or once a month or once a day, however frequently you wanted to, you could go in, you get asked 20 questions. These are based on the 20 most common symptoms. And you get asked to say if you have one of these symptoms and then to grade the burden that they have on your quality of life on 0 to 5. So you have the 20 symptoms, the burden from 0 to 5. So you get a score out of 100. And then when you get that score, you'll be told for a woman of your age who's on HRT or not on HRT, how that compares to the population average. Using that kind of tool might be a good indicator, but it's a case of just listening. Do I feel different to how I did 5 years ago, 10 years ago? You know, talking to your friends, having conversations and realizing it's not just hot flushes, it's not just night sweats.
Yeah, I always say hot flushes and night sweats get all the PR.
Yes, you're totally right.
Everybody talks about those, but they are not the biggest symptom. I really do believe it is, I think women, we are rushing around, we're caring for children, we're caring for elderly parents, we're working, we've got big ass jobs, whatever it may be, we're not paying enough attention to our body and listening to our body. And if the Menoscale can help you just pay that little bit of attention, it's almost like mindfulness around your body and how you're feeling. Because I know for me, my experience was, you know what, I'm okay, but I'm not optimized. Like I'm not as good as I was X many years ago at, I don't know, writing a deck or writing a document or whatever it might be. So you know, like deep down, you do kind of know how you're feeling. The other thing I love about the Menoscale is, as we started the podcast talking about the imbalance in research, this is an amazing way. Like everybody listening, if you want to be part of community science, or I think Zoe has this great citizen science or citizen research, I don't know, whatever we call it. But if you want to be part of research, then this Menoscale is great because it's going to contribute to more information, more knowledge so that we can then educate and feed back to everybody on women's health in general. I think that's really empowering for people.
Yeah, and this is what we're trying to do with all of our research at Zoe. It's what we call bi-directional. So people become community scientists, i.e. when you share your data, if you consent to do so with the Menoscale, then it shares the data back with me and my research team. So I can learn, for example, we've had 133 different countries completing this. I can start to see if there's differences between different countries, how it differs according to age, how it differs according to HRT, and it's by collecting this vast amount of data that we can really learn. Now, what the user gets back is they get back their score, they get back information about their main symptoms, where they fit compared to population averages. And it's really important that we do that kind of bi-directional process, that we can learn as scientists and individuals can learn as well about themselves. So yeah, Menoscale is a great example of the community science work that we're doing, that as long as, there is a separate consent, because obviously we have to be very careful about sharing data. But if you consent to share your data with researchers, it's basically sharing it with me and my team so that we can learn.
We are sharing our data with Professor Sarah Berry. I feel like we are in very safe hands if it's with you, Sarah. Okay.
And it's all anonymized. It's really important to say everything's anonymized. So we handle data very carefully.
So let's dig in a little bit to what you have learned. What were the big wow moments? Like when the research came back, what was the stuff that you went, oh my God, we need to tell people about this?
So I think just how many people experience symptoms was a big wow for me. So I'm quite new to menopause research. My whole career has been looking at the impact of diet on cardiometabolic disease. So looking at how diet impacts things like blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. But it's through Zoe, because we have these big community science projects, that I'm diving into new areas. And so for about the last 3-4 years, I've been diving into menopause. And although I'm reasonably well read on the area of what other researchers are doing in this area, I still thought, well, yeah, it's a tough time, but, people get on with it, sort of thing. But seeing that 99% of the perimenopausal women that responded to our survey said that they had at least one symptom, 66% said they had 12 or more symptoms. That's huge. And we know from some other work that's been done in the UK that 10% of women are leaving the workforce because of their menopause symptoms. And this is at a point in time where, for most women, they're at the peak of their career. Their children are slightly more grown up, that yes, it's still hard work, but, they're able to really focus more again on their career. And so I think for me, just realising actually just how many women were suffering symptoms and how in the past we've just not talked about it. And to think that nearly 100% of women are having some sort of symptom burden was huge. And then I think for me was also seeing what symptoms were most prevalent, so that it's all the brain related symptoms, the brain fog, the memory loss, the irritability, the anxiety, and learning more about just how much it affects that side of things rather than what we see as the more physical symptoms. I think that's been really, really surprising. And particularly, anxiety, 80% of women suffering from anxiety because of menopause, and just how much, therefore, it does impact women day to day. And then another few key findings that I thought were really interesting was the association with body weight, or BMI. So people who had a higher body mass index had significantly higher chances of having symptoms and having more burdensome symptoms. And I thought that was really interesting, but also it's challenging because if you're of a higher body mass index, we know that people aren't willingly living with obesity. And it's like this vicious circle that if you're experiencing, therefore, more severe symptoms, so you're not sleeping well, you have low mood, et cetera, it makes then it even harder to tackle, living with obesity as well.
Everybody's talking about the gut right now, like
Yep.
gut-mind connection, gut-skin connection. And I saw that the study showed that there was this really powerful shift that happens in a woman's metabolism and in her microbiome during perimenopause and after perimenopause. So what shift did you see happening there?
Now, fortunately, we are sitting on this gold mine of data. So with the Menoscale calculator, this is just self-reported, so that it's just people telling us about their symptoms and a few simple answers about things like their age, etc. But on what we call our Zoe Predict cohort, so this is that group of individuals of 70,000 peri and postmenopausal women where we have all of these biochemical measures, we've been looking at factors like metabolic health and looking at factors like the microbiome. And what we see in those individuals is that peri and postmenopausal women have a microbiome composition that's quite different to pre-menopausal women. And there has been some research that was published some years ago by another researcher that showed that in general, the microbiome composition of premenopausal women and men is a little bit different. But if you look at peri and postmenopausal women, their microbiome composition is quite similar to men. So just in the way that we see people's disease risk, peri and postmenopausally, becomes similar to men, it's interesting that their microbiome composition also becomes more similar to men. And what we see when we looked at the microbiome composition, and just for those that don't know, these are the trillions of bacteria that live in our gut that we know have wide-reaching effects on loads of aspects to do with our health, from our brain function to our heart health, and so much more. And what we found was that peri and postmenopausal women had, like I said, a slightly different microbiome composition to premenopausal women. And they had a higher prevalence. They had more species that we had previously shown to be associated with inflammation, with poor metabolic health, higher blood pressure, higher blood cholesterol, etc. And that the premenopausal women had less of these species compared to the postmenopausal women. So that was really interesting. Now, where diet then fits into this is something that we're really trying to disentangle now as well.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting that, physiologically the body is changing. So, if women are struggling with, I'm doing the same thing, but I can't lose the weight, or I'm putting on more weight. And if somebody just says, well, just lose some weight or just go on it, it's not that simple. It's not that helpful, is it? We have to do a few things differently, maybe.
Yeah, I think this is what's really tough is there's lots going on. We've got to remember we have estrogen receptors on nearly every cell in our body. Our brain is like a hive of estrogen receptors, and this is only recently becoming recognized. But everywhere else in our body, we have estrogen receptors. This is why the symptoms are so wide-reaching, and this is why the impact it has on our physiology and disease risk is so wide-reaching. And so when it comes to weight, for example, what we know is that estrogen in very simple terms, directs fat to our hips in women. So, we often hear of people saying, oh, women are pear-shaped, men are apple-shaped. Now, when you lose estrogen, so when you're in the perimenopausal or postmenopausal, you no longer have that protective effect of estrogen kind of directing the fat cells to your hips. And so you start to put deposit fat around your belly. So we call this visceral adiposity. So you become more apple-shaped, which is more like the male typical shape. We know that fat around your belly is particularly harmful for us metabolically, that it reduces insulin sensitivity, is very pro-inflammatory, for example. And so you could be eating exactly the same stuff. You could be doing exactly the same level of physical activity, but just because of this change in estrogen, where you deposit your fat changes. So you get that more apple shape. But also estrogen affects loads of other factors related to our metabolism, like how we metabolize glucose. And this is something we've looked a lot at, how we perceive hunger. So you often hear people say, well, I'm eating exactly the same, but I'm always hungry. I mean, this is what I feel. I'm constantly hungry, and I'm probably eating even more. And it's because it affects our hunger signals. We know that it impacts how we process glucose. So we've done some work in 1,000 individuals where we looked at what we call postprandial glycemia. This is the increase in circulating blood glucose that happens in the 2 hours after having a high carbohydrate meal. And what we found was that in peri and postmenopausal women, the increase in circulating blood sugar or blood glucose after carbohydrates was significantly higher compared to pre-menopausal women. And even when we age-matched individuals to try and check, is this just part of aging or is it due to estrogen? So even when we selected out a subgroup of people who were the same age, half of who were peri and postmenopausal, half of who were premenopausal, we still saw this significant difference. And so what that means is that when these peri and postmenopausal women are having carbohydrates, they're having these bigger excursions in circulating blood glucose, potentially bigger dips. We know that's all related to cardiometabolic health. It's all related to hunger, etc. as well. So there's so much going on. And so this whole idea of, just eat what you normally ate, work out like you normally did, and the weight won't go on. No, it's not that. And then on top of that, 80% of women are having a bad night's sleep.
And then, Sarah, my God, I mean...
I'm painting gloom and doom, aren't I? But you know what? I do think if we know and empowered, and if we could use sleep as a quick example here, we know if you have a poor night's sleep, the reward centers in your brain are heightened. So they'll be saying, Lisa, you've had a crap night's sleep. Go have that pastry. Go have that chocolate. It will be driving you to all of these unhealthy foods that then set you on this roller coaster of glucose, feeling hungry, etc. We know that you also have these worse blood sugar responses if you've had a poor night's sleep. So I do think, whilst I don't want to paint doom and gloom, I think being aware that this is going on, being aware that, I've had a poor night's sleep and my body is saying, Lisa, go get this, go have this, food that's not good for you. If you're aware of it, I do think it does help a little bit to say, okay, it is going to be harder this morning for me to resist X, Y, and Z. I have to be even more mindful about what I have. So it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do about it. It just means we have to be a bit more aware.
I mean, hallelujah, Sarah, because this show is called Menopause.
I'm sorry, I'm realizing I'm painting like this doom and gloom. And do you know what, Lisa, I'm a 47-year-old woman in the midst of perimenopause, and I'm actually, despite the memory loss and brain fog and a little bit of irritability, feeling the best I've ever felt. And it's because it's a point in time where I have suddenly been like, oh my gosh, everything is changing. I have to be really careful now, and not careful in that kind of negative, like, over focusing way. But it's been for me a real point in time where, hey, I'm going to take control of my health. And I actually feel physically better than I've ever felt.
Oh my God.
So yeah, I am menopause-positive.
Yeah. You and me both. You and me both. I just think, like I said earlier, we cannot prevent menopause from happening, but there are a myriad of ways that we can set ourselves up for a more positive perimenopause and menopause experience. And that's why I created the show, is to educate women on all the different ways that they can do that. This show is going to be a pick and mix of different modalities and strategies and tips. Menopause, it's this totally normal experience, but normal doesn't always have to mean unpleasant. So we know the science, and I think understanding is the first step. When we know what's going on in our body, there are actual changes that are going on in our body. We are not going crazy, right? Like, there are things happening. So now let's understand them. And now what are we going to do about them? What are the things that are going to work for Sarah, for Lisa, for Susan, for Helen, for Emma? Everybody can choose the routes that are best for them. But when it comes to this study in particular, obviously healthy diet, right? What does that look like when we say healthy diet?
So a healthy diet is different for everyone. And I think it's important to say that. And this is something we've spent a lot of time researching at Zoe, is looking at how variable people's responses are to food. But what underpins the basis is the same for everyone. So it's the kind of optimization that's slightly different for everyone. But when we think about a healthy diet, and when we think about the kind of healthy diet that we've seen to be associated with a reduced risk of menopause symptoms, we're talking about a diet that's not, unfortunately, similar to the terrible diet that we currently have in the UK and the US. We're talking about a diet that's very rich in unprocessed foods, so whole foods in the way in which they were created, rich in plant-based foods, so very rich in pulses, in fruits, in vegetables, in nuts, in seeds. A diet that's rich in variety, so getting a variety of different plant-based foods. We know that foods are not just a simple case of the macronutrients, the fiber, the fat, the protein, the carbohydrate, but actually each food contains on average 72,000 chemicals, and we want to get a diversity of these chemicals. And so diversity in the diet is really important, so that you get a big diversity of different chemicals, which we know can feed our gut microbiome, but also impact different areas to do with our health. And then thinking a little bit about what you need to limit. And I hate using the word limit, but I think we still have to be realistic that there is a lot of food. Our current food landscape is very much pitted against us. So there's lots of food that we are exposed to that I think we need to be more mindful about whether we really want to be or should be eating those foods. So refined carbohydrates. So, your refined white breads, for example, white rice, white pasta. Your heavily processed unhealthy foods like processed red meats, for example, cakes, pastries, all of the kind of over-processed packaged foods that are really low in fiber, really high in freely accessible sugar, high in salt, high in saturated fat. And so if we can just stick to, as much as possible, cooking our food from scratch, and I know that's really difficult when we've got full-time jobs and kids, I find it a huge challenge. Thinking about the diversity, thinking about foods that are really rich in fiber, and thinking about having as much plant-based food as possible, I think then you're getting off to a really good start.
How do you... Oh, sorry to interrupt. How do you feel about, there's a lot of talk about protein right now, animal protein. The study specifically calls out plant-based protein versus animal protein.
So I think that it's a lot more nuanced than, saying animal or plant. It's the same when it comes to fat and saturated fat, that we know that there's different quality within this. So if we take saturated fat as an example, we now know that there's good evidence to show that saturated fat, if it's in fermented dairy, like cheese, for example, and yogurt, actually doesn't have a negative impact on our health, can actually be good for us. Yet saturated fat in unfermented dairy, like butter, despite having the same fat composition to cheese, we know is not good for us. We're not quite there in the evidence with protein yet. Saturated fat has been researched a lot. Protein has not been researched so much, but we do know that there's different qualities of protein. I think the key thing is to make sure that what food you're eating, you're getting your protein from, that it's about the overall healthfulness of that food. So rather than thinking, oh, should it be plant, should it be animal? If you're getting that protein from chicken, for example, and you're comfortable eating chicken, I know many people choose not to eat meat for animal welfare or environmental reasons, but if you're happy to eat meat, having your protein from chicken is a great source. But likewise, you can get adequate protein from a plant-based diet. You just need to be a little bit more mindful about it.
And the other thing, and this is where I want everybody to really just tune in for a second. If you started doing the dishes or whatever, or reading a magazine, or you're just about to run into a meeting, just pause for 1 second, because the study also showed that if you make these small changes to your diet, you can see a change in just 6 months. Is that right? To the menopause symptoms?
Less than that.
Less than 6 months? Tell me more.
We saw that diet was very closely associated with the prevalence of symptoms. So people who had a healthier diet had less symptoms. So then what we did is we actually followed people up over a period of time. So we had a group of 4,000 individuals who were peri- and postmenopausal women. We asked them about their symptoms at baseline, and then we followed them on the Zoe program, which is basically a healthy eating program. Very, a diet that's very rich in these plant-based, unprocessed foods, very high in fiber, low in refined carbohydrates. And we followed them up over 12 to 18 weeks. And we found that after 12 to 18 weeks, when we asked people again about their menopause symptoms, on average, people reported a 35% reduction in menopause symptoms after just 12 weeks of following a healthy diet.
So sorry, let's just say that again so that everybody captures that. So repeat that one more time.
So we found that after as little as 12 weeks of peri- and postmenopausal women changing their diet to a healthier diet, they experienced on average a 35% reduction.
I've got goosebumps all over my body from that. That is amazing. And I think it's really important because, again, let's just pause for 1 second. You mentioned earlier the number of women that leave work because of menopause symptoms. I think there's something like 900,000 women in the UK have left work because of menopause symptoms. I think I saw another study. It was like 1 in 10 women leave. And I tried to find similar data for the US and I couldn't find any, but I can only assume that the numbers are quite similar in the US. That is insane that if you think of it, that one of the best places for you to start is with diet and nutrition, and it's free, and it could help you continue to have a full, fulfilling life. If work or whatever it may be, looking after your children, looking after your family, just loving yourself and feeling good about yourself, why not? This is amazing. Sorry, I can keep going on in that. Should we just pause for dramatic effect?
I think what's interesting as well is we looked at this according to whether people were taking HRT, so hormone replacement therapy, or were not taking HRT. And what we found was that there was a similar size of reduction regardless of whether you're on HRT or not. So we found that people who are on HRT, although they have a lower symptom burden, they still had a 35% reduction. So it wasn't as big because they're from a lower starting point, but they still saw the same percent change. People who weren't on HRT, they were starting off with a higher symptom burden, but they had that 35% change. And I think, Lisa, it is really empowering because it shows that diet can help. But I would like to just caveat it with two things. I know we're being menopositive, but as a research scientist, we spend our life caveating everything. So the first caveat to say is this is a study where we followed people over a period of time. We had no control arm. And so to say something is truly causal, i.e. diet is truly causing that benefit, we would have need to have randomly allocated people to kind of a placebo, etc. So it is really important I caveat with that. And that's what we want to do next. Although I would say there has been a trial that has done something similar where they put people on a typical kind of Western diet and then they put people on a Mediterranean diet, which is very similar to what we would consider to be the healthiest diet. And they saw a similarish magnitude of reduction, around 30%. So, it's confirmative of what other people have reported. The second caveat to say is that you made the point is free, and it is free, but it's really, really hard to change dietary behaviours. It's really hard to change what you're used to having, whether it's culturally, whether it's what's accessible to you, whether it's what's affordable to you, whether it's what you're used to cooking, whether you're limited with time. There's all of these kind of unseen barriers around you that dictate what you eat as an individual. We can recognise that. But do you know what we can do in a positive way? We can think, okay, it is hard. What simple step can I start with? And so we can think about what is the simplest single strategy I can do to have the maximal benefit. And lots of people really over-focus, I think, on their main meals, their dinner, or how can I make my dinner healthy? Well, actually, 25% of our energy in the UK and the US comes from snacks. 20% of our energy comes from breakfast. Both snacks and breakfast typically are under our own individual control. What I eat for my dinner is dictated by what time I get back from work, what my fussy kids will eat, what I happen to have actually taken out of the freezer if I'd remembered. But my snacks aren't dictated by my children. My breakfast isn't dictated by, these kind of circumstances. And most people find it's easy to change their breakfast, easy to change their snacks. And so I think that if we're going to ask someone to change their diet, try and find what's the easiest for you to change, given we know it's really difficult. And we've conducted a study that we published a few years ago where we asked people just to change their snacks. We said we randomly allocated half of the people to eat 20% of their energy from typical UK snacks, and we provided all of these to the individuals. And then we randomly allocated the other half of the group to eat 20% of their energy from nuts. And what we found was that those who were having their snacks in the form of nuts, they ended up being so much healthier. This is after just 6 weeks. They actually had a predicted reduction in cardiovascular disease risk of 30%. Based on some of the other results. That's just from changing their snacks. And we see in our research, where we've been doing this deep dive of diet and menopause symptoms, nuts and seeds seem to be one of the food groups that's most strongly associated with a reduction in menopause symptoms. So, just changing one of your snacks in the day to some nuts, that might help. And that doesn't mean like, oh my gosh, how am I going to change my whole diet? And what will my kids eat? And what will my husband eat?
I agree. And this is, Menopausitive is really just about how you can take a proactive approach to your own well-being. And it's one foot in front of the other. I have to tell you, though, it is a running joke with my friends because I don't go anywhere without a bag of nuts. My husband and I roast almonds and cashews, I think, weekly. I've got a whole jar. You do not want to be sitting next to me on an airplane. It's like if all of a sudden somebody has a nut allergy, it's going to ruin my entire flight. But no, but I carry this bag of nuts around. It's actually a bit of a joke. Now, I read, Sarah, that when you go to bed, you think about what you learned that day and what you'd like to do better tomorrow. But on our show, we finish every episode with this question. So, knowing what we know now about diet and menopause, what would you tell our 35-year-old listener, our 45-year-old listener, and our 55-year-old listener?
Oh my gosh, this is a tough question. I get asked tough questions at the end of lots of podcasts, but I think this beats them all, Lisa. If someone was to say to me at 35, 45, 55, what can I do to be healthy? Well, the first thing I would do is I'd say, make sure you find a way of living, your diet, your lifestyle that makes you happy. You know, I always say to people, if a food's too healthy to be enjoyed, it's just not healthy at all. The other thing I would say is don't just think about what you eat, think also about how you eat. And this is something that I think we're becoming more and more aware of. And I think that this is really powerful as well for peri and postmenopausal women. We know that how you eat your food also matters. And by this, I mean how fast you eat your food. So we know, for example, if you can just reduce how fast you eat a meal by 20%, you, without even realizing it, can reduce your energy intake by 15%. So for women who are worried during the menopause transition about putting weight on, that's a good strategy. Be mindful about how quickly you're eating your food. The other thing that we can think about is a fasting period. And so we know that a large proportion of people, and we know from our own data, about 30% of people snack after 9 in the evening. 50% of people eat after 8 in the evening. If you're eating later at night, we know it's worse for your metabolic health. We know also that you'll actually wake up more hungry the next day. And given that we talked about how many menopausal women are more hungry than they were premenopausally, again, thinking about the timing that you're eating, try and finish your last meal at 8 o'clock. Try and having a fast period of maybe 12 to 13 hours. So if you're having your last meal at 8 in the evening, try not to have your next meal maybe till 9 in the morning, for example. So I think my tip would be, therefore, to think not just about the food that you're eating, but think about all the other tools in the toolbox and find one that works for you, while still enabling yourself to enjoy the pleasure of food, because it is part of our culture, it's part of our emotions, it's part of how we socialize, and we shouldn't make food this thing to be feared.
I think we will end there. Professor Sarah Berry, thank you so much. And congratulations to you and the whole team at Zoe for this amazing work that you're doing. It's been such a joy to talk to you today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, and by the way, I knew you were menopositive when you downloaded this episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love bringing this information to you, and I love that you're taking control of your health. You can follow Menopositive on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. Join me next week as we discover more ways to optimize our bodies. Because together, we're going to redefine menopause.
I got a good feeling.